In the year 2023, a small airplane carrying 7 passengers flew over the Amazon rainforest in Colombia. Due to an engine malfunction, the plane crashed among the dense trees. Large numbers of Colombian military forces, along with some local indigenous people and volunteers, were mobilized to search for the missing aircraft and attempt to rescue any survivors. Our story begins in a small village along the banks of the Jabora River. In this village lived a mother named Magdalene, 33 years old, with her 4 children. Their grandmother, Fatima, also lived with them. Her husband, Manuel, was not living with them, more than 300 kilometers away. He had asked Magdalene to leave the village with the children and move to the city. Despite his bad treatment and abusive behavior, Magdalene depended on him financially and agreed to the move to give her children a better life. The only way out of the village was by small planes, as there were no roads leading elsewhere. On May 1, 2023, Magdalene secretly took her 4 children and boarded a small plane. The children, unfamiliar with flying, were nervous but excited. The plane took off and ascended into the sky, revealing the endless green of the Amazon rainforest beneath. Suddenly, the plane started to shake violently. The pilot began communicating with the control center in San Jose de Rio Claro, reporting that the engine had failed and that they were descending uncontrollably. The control center asked for their location, which the pilot provided, and he announced he would attempt an emergency landing, and no moment passed except that the plane crashed in the Amazon forests. Contact with the control center was cut off, and within the following hours, the Colombian Civil Aviation Authority and the Colombian Air Force were mobilized. They began the search for the missing plane. The plane was carrying 7 passengers, the pilot and a passenger, in addition to Mother Magdalene and her 4 children, Leslie, Solini, Tian, and Christine. The search teams and the aircraft circling around believed that the pilot tried to land in the river because it was nearby. However, he probably couldn't reach it and was forced to land somewhere amidst the forests and trees. The initial aerial search did not lead to any results. Everything they saw in front of them was endless green patches extending to the horizon with no trace of the plane. After 4 days passed without the aircraft's location being determined, the Army established a special unit to follow up on this case. A general named Sanchez was appointed to lead this unit and coordinate the search operations. A central headquarters was created for the unit, and this headquarters studied the case, all its details, and the information they had. They knew that the plane had departed from the village, heading to the town of Sarkozy. The distance of the journey was about 300 kilometers, but halfway, the engine failed, and the plane crashed in the middle of the forests. The coordinates they had about the plane's location before contact was lost specified the general area where the plane might have fallen, but they did not have an exact location, meaning there was a large margin of error in pinpointing the site. Based on this margin of error, they estimated the search area to be about 320 square kilometers, a very vast area. General Sanchez decided to use a special forces team of 26 soldiers and send them to this area to search for the plane on the ground because aerial searches had not yielded any results. The team began organized operations. They divided the area into a grid of squares, and each group of soldiers would sweep through one square. All these squares were marked with GPS coordinates, and the headquarters monitored the scan process via satellites, coordinating between them and the soldiers on the ground. So, they were systematically sweeping the entire area, but the search for the plane was not the only concern for the soldiers. These forests were considered dangerous places. The primary reason, of course, was obvious. The area was full of predatory and dangerous animals, as well as countless snakes and toxic insects. But this was not the only reason. The Amazon forests in Colombia are active with some of the world's most dangerous armed militias and drug gangs. These gangs establish themselves with farms and bases deep within these forests, places that are difficult to reach and hide in. The biggest commodity they produce on these farms is cocaine. these gang members are criminals, murderers, and heavily armed with the most dangerous weapons. So, the soldiers had to be cautious not only of animals and the dangers of the jungle, but also of the drug gangs and armed militias present inside these forests. Even during the search and their movements within the jungle, they didn't make any noise. The search was completely silent, and they used signals to communicate. If they spoke, it was in whispers so as not to attract the attention of any gangs or criminals that might be present in the area. General Sanchez and the command headquarters believed that with this organized search method, relying on technology, GPS, and satellite positioning, they would find the plane quickly. They were sweeping the entire area, square by square, but days passed, and we reached day 12. They had scanned 90% of the search area without any result. Of course, with each passing day, the chances of finding any survivors decreased more and more. Despite all this, the army refused to accept help from the native populations of these regions. There are villages around the Amazon forests and rivers where people considered indigenous, people who are part of the local community, like the village where the children and their mother were from. These indigenous residents, who are the original inhabitants of the area, wanted to help with the search. In the end, these are the people who lost loved ones just like their own. Even beyond the pilot, the mother, and her children. There was another passenger on this plane. The passenger was one of the leaders among the indigenous populations. They wanted to search for the plane together with the army, but the army refused their help. The reason? Because there are sensitivities and tensions between the army and the indigenous people. Because most of the members of the armed militias and drug gangs are originally from the indigenous populations, meaning they come from these villages and communities. Of course, when we say indigenous populations, it doesn't mean that the soldiers in the army are from another place. They are, after all citizens of Colombia. But the indigenous people referred to here are those who still live in villages amidst the forests and these areas. You might consider them as the Bedouins of Colombia, because many criminals and gang members come from indigenous communities. This causes sensitivities between the army and the indigenous populations. The army sometimes conducts operations against these gangs and militias, but amid this fighting, innocent people from the indigenous communities sometimes fall victim. The history of these conflicts is full of painful stories that created great tensions between the indigenous people and the Colombian government and army. That's why the army refused to accept help from the indigenous populations in searching for the missing plane. However, in reality, groups of indigenous people did head to the Amazon forests and started efforts to search for the plane, contrary to the army's instructions. One of these groups included Manuel, who is the husband of the children's mother, as we mentioned. He is the father of the two youngest children, Tian, who is 4 years old, and Christine, who is 11 months old, and Leslie, the older sister, who is 13, and Selene, who is 9. They are from a different father, of course. Someone from among the indigenous community around Manuel knew about his poor relationship with his wife and about his abuse toward her. All they saw in front of them was a sad father searching for his wife and children. Anyway, the indigenous people believed they had greater competence than the army in searching through the forests, even if the army was more advanced in terms of technology and equipment. Ultimately, they are the children of the Amazon, having lived their entire lives in these forests, knowing their secrets and ways. So, groups of indigenous people spread out to look for the plane in the area. We reached day 15 of the search. On this day, the soldiers found a small feeding bottle in the forest. When the news reached the command center, General Sanchez was surprised. How could they find such a small feeding bottle, but not the large plane? Where did it disappear to? But at least this was a sign that they were searching in the right place, and probably close to the plane. After seeing the secrets of the indigenous groups in their search, General Sanchez decided to involve them officially in the operation, seeing their determination and their knowledge. He asked for their assistance and ordered his ground troops to cooperate with them. And this was, by the way, an unprecedented thing in Colombian history, that the army cooperates with indigenous populations. Usually, these two groups were always in conflict. The soldiers directed the indigenous groups to the place where they found the feeding bottle, saying they were searching around that area because the plane was probably there. Indeed, the squads of soldiers and the indigenous groups spread around the feeding area. It wasn't long before, after only a few hours, one of the indigenous groups returned with news. They finally found the plane. It was crashed, fallen with its front part completely destroyed. The soldiers reached the plane and began examining it inside and out. The first thing they noticed, unfortunately, was the presence of 3 bodies. These bodies were of the adults on board the plane. The first was the plane's captain. The second was one of the passengers who was also a leader among the indigenous people, and the third was Mother Magdalene. As for the 4 children, there was no trace of them. But this didn't mean they survived, because even the bodies of the adults had been torn apart by predators, animals that had come and gnawed at them. Even parts of their bodies were gone, leaving only bones. As for the children, since their bodies were smaller, perhaps the wild animals dragged them away and found their bodies along with others. But the soldiers noticed something else. Around the plane, there were open travel bags, with clothes and belongings scattered everywhere. Even if we assume the bags flew out during the crash, who would open those bags and scatter their contents? It was obvious that some people had opened the bags and searched inside them. These people were probably the children, as indicated by the feeding bottle they found earlier. Surely they had taken it from one of the bags. Of course, here, feelings of sadness mixed with feelings of relief, the sadness for those who died, but also happiness for the children's survival and hope that they were still alive. But, of course, 15 days had passed since the crash, and if the children were still alive, their condition must be very severe. How could children of that age survive in the harsh, wild Amazon forests all this time? And with each passing day, this challenge would only get harder and harder. They had to move as fast as possible and try to find themselves in the shortest time, unless they were still alive. Let's see what happened to the children after the plane crashed and hit the ground. Zoli's older sister, Leslie, who is 13 years old, hit her head against the side of the plane and was unconscious for a short while. After she regained consciousness and started to regain her awareness, she heard her brother crying around her. Her mother, who was severely injured and bleeding heavily, was sitting there emitting faint sounds, trying to cling to her last breath of life. But after a few moments, she took her final breath and died right in front of her children. Zoli didn't know what to do, nor did she even know how to feel. Her brother were crying around her, and her mother was dead in front of her. She couldn't even comprehend the situation they were in. Tears filled her eyes. She wanted to cry for her mother and brother, but at the same time, she knew she had to be the mother for them now. The first thing she noticed when she started to understand the situation was her infant sister, Christine, who was only 11 months old, was in her mother's hands. Zoli had to lift her dead mother's hands and take her infant sister from her. It was a scene beyond imagination or comprehension. Then she took her sister Selene, who was 9 years old, and her brother Tian, who was 4 years old, and managed to lift them out of the plane. As soon as Zoli's foot touched the ground, she began to realize she was also injured. She had a wound in her knee, making walking difficult. All of them were terrified. Zoli felt fear and horror, but she tried to stay calm and not show her feelings to her younger brother and sisters. If she broke down, they all would too. She had to gather her strength and hold herself together any way she could. The worst part was that they were in a desolate and difficult place amid the vast Amazon forests in an unknown spot. At night, the forest turned into a very frightening place. They couldn't see anything, but they could hear the sounds of thousands of animals and insects moving all around them. The night was terrifying. At that moment, Zoli realized they couldn't survive if they stayed in that spot. They had to try moving somewhere else or find a way out of the forest. The first thing they did was open the luggage bags they found. Inside, they discovered some food and supplies, as well as some feeding bottles and milk for her infant sister, Christine. Zoli had to make sure her brother and sisters ate and strengthened themselves because she knew they'd probably have to walk long distances. Her little brother Tian kept asking her when their mother would wake up. He didn't understand what was happening, nor did he grasp the concept of death, nor that their mother would never return. Zoli and her siblings took what they could from the supplies, clothes, and bags, then immediately left the spot. Her injured leg made walking very difficult, and she had to carry her infant sister along with her, a task almost impossible. But, by the grace of God, she found the strength to stand and walk despite all these hardships. She tried to use the sun to determine the direction of west, believing it was the closest way to exit the forest. During their journey, they dropped the feeding bottle they found earlier. The soldiers and search team, meanwhile, were carefully tracking the crash site, trying to determine which direction the children might have taken. The problem was that 15 days had passed since the crash. If the children were still alive, they could have covered a large distance, which would significantly expand the search area. General Sanchez ordered more troops, search teams, and a large number of helicopters and support planes to intensify the efforts. They were racing against time. Every moment that passed decreased the chances of the children's survival. Their search tactics changed initially. The soldiers had been searching quietly to avoid attracting gang members or other threats hidden in the forests. But now, they had to change their approach. They started shouting Zoli's name loudly and calling out to the children to attract their attention if they were nearby. While searching around the crash site, the soldiers found additional clues indicating the children's presence. They discovered some remnants of fruits or berries with human bite marks, probably eaten by the children. They also brought in a trained search dog named Wilson. Wilson was able to find new evidence, footprints clearly belonging to children. The footprints were near a shelter made from large leaves, with a small pair of scissors and a tiny ribbon nearby. The soldiers sensed they were very close to the children, surely not far from that spot. Following these developments, news about the case spread rapidly across media outlets and newspapers. The story gained worldwide attention and even became one of the most talked about stories in 2023. It was one of the most famous stories globally, especially in Colombia, where everyone was talking about the missing children of the Amazon. With this fame, the Colombian government decided to allocate greater resources to the search operation. They gave General Sanchez full authority and an open budget. The general decided to use every available tool, including involving indigenous populations, despite the tensions and conflicts between them and the military. This case united everyone with a common goal: finding the children. The command center issued a public announcement welcoming any help or volunteers from the indigenous communities. An emergency state was declared, and many indigenous volunteers joined the search. The army itself used helicopters and planes to transport these volunteers from their villages around the Amazon into the search area. General Sanchez personally welcomed and motivated the volunteers, giving them powerful speeches, thanking them for their participation in the operation. This cooperation between the army and the indigenous people was unprecedented in Colombian history. These groups, traditionally in conflict and disagreement, united for a single purpose: finding the children. The operation was named Operation Hope. The army deployed a distinctive yellow ribbon along an 11-kilometer stretch of trees around the crash site and installed sirens on this ribbon so that if the children were nearby and heard the sound, they could signal their location. They also recorded a voice message in the voice of the children's grandmother, Fatima, telling them to stay where they are. This message was broadcast from large speakers mounted on helicopters, using her familiar and reassuring voice to comfort and guide the children. Additionally, a team of soldiers spread out across different parts of the area, moving in coordinated formations. They broadcast the same message through loudspeakers and also scattered papers and flyers throughout the region. These flyers contained a message to the children, instructing them to stay beside the river and not to move from their places. At night, they used a large number of searchlights, shining them into the sky, combined with loudspeakers that continued to broadcast their grandmother, Fatima's reassuring message. They also launched red distress signals indicating specific locations, trying every possible method to attract the children's attention. The teams worked tirelessly, employing every technique at their disposal. The indigenous people and volunteers adopted a different approach from the military. It was more intuitive and based on their knowledge of the forests. They didn't rely on any technology. Instead, they navigated the dense woods using natural landmarks: a water pool, a uniquely shaped tree, a large rock, anything that could help them identify their location. The indigenous tribes believed in certain spiritual beliefs, superstitions, that the forests had gods and supernatural forces residing within them. They thought that spirits and powerful entities might be with them or against them. To seek help from these spirits, they performed rituals, religious ceremonies that they believed would invoke their aid. During these rituals, they experienced hallucinations, dreams, and visions that made them feel as if they were merging with the forest and its spirits. Of course, these experiences were rooted in their use of drugs like cocaine and tobacco during the rituals, which caused hallucinations and altered perceptions. Over time, when they failed to find the children, some of them believed that evil spirits or supernatural forces were blocking the children from their reach. These spirits, they thought, wanted the children to remain lost in the forest. The mission to find and rescue them would then be extremely difficult. During the nights, they reported hearing strange voices and seeing movement among the trees, convinced these were the spirits of the forest that kept the children hidden from them. Now, on day 24 of the search operation, regardless of the superstitions the indigenous people believed, their search approach resembled trying to mimic the children's movements in a semi-random way. They attempted to imagine where the children might have gone, placing themselves in their shoes. Surprisingly, this method yielded results. They found new evidence: garments scattered on the ground, as if the children had changed clothes, and a new shelter, like a small tent made from large leaves. Beside it, they discovered a discarded diaper, certainly belonging to little Christine, the infant. This discovery renewed their hope that the children were still alive, though their situation was undoubtedly difficult. More than 3 weeks had passed since their disappearance, and their grandmother Fatima remained hopeful. She believed that the children, having grown up in the village, knew how to survive in the forest, distinguishing edible fruits from poisonous ones and recognizing safe hiding spots. Leslie, the older sister, was also presumed to know how to build a shelter from leaves. Today marked day 26 of the search, May 26, 2023, Christine's first birthday since the crash. She was only 11 months old when the plane went down, and now she had completed her first year of life lost in the Amazon rainforest, along with her siblings. In a symbolic gesture, the search team even organized a small birthday celebration for her at the command center, showing solidarity and hope. Leslie faced the daunting task of inventing new methods to keep her brother and sister alive. The only water they had was the rainwater collected in the diaper that was lost along with Christine. She had to use leaves to make a makeshift container, soaking and shaping them to hold water for drinking and washing. But the greatest challenge was caring for little Christine. She couldn't drink water easily, and caring for her was extremely difficult, cleaning her, feeding her, and keeping her alive. Sometimes, they were fortunate enough to find some fallen fruits from the trees. or even some monkeys on the branches throwing down fruits as if trying to help. But even when they found edible fruits, they weren't always easy to eat. Some were hard, bitter, and needed to be chewed thoroughly. Leslie had to chew the fruits herself to soften them for her younger brother and sister. Hunger was a constant, gnawing at all of them, affecting their bodies' movements and strength. The situation was dire, and their physical condition worsened day by day. On top of all this, Leslie bore the greatest physical burden, carrying her infant sister Christine. Sometimes her younger sister Selene, just 9 years old, helped carry Christine. But the main load was on Leslie, making their movement even more difficult. This added to their exhaustion. Their psychological state was equally fragile. Sometimes, they would sit in one place, overwhelmed by hunger, pain, and fatigue, and burst into tears. Leslie was the only one trying to hold herself together, trying not to cry so her brother and sister wouldn't lose hope. But she felt immense pressure, as if she were carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Besides the pain of losing their mother, she had to strengthen her heart and body to care for her little siblings and lead them towards safety. The greatest terror came at night. Once darkness fell, the Amazon's forests transformed into a terrifying place filled with dangerous animals and insects. It was as if the forest came alive at night, turning into a nightmare of threats from every direction. On one occasion, they nearly got bitten by a venomous snake that had stealthily approached them from behind. Luckily, they noticed it in time. Leslie managed to kill it with a sturdy branch. During this arduous journey, Leslie experienced moments of despair and utter hopelessness. Her mental state reached its lowest point, her heart pounding, her breathing labored, and she felt suffocated by the burden she carried. She decided to leave her brother and sister behind for a moment to walk alone, seeking some relief. She walked a distance by herself, then suddenly collapsed onto the ground, crying bitterly. For weeks, she had not shed a tear. She had been so focused on keeping her family strong that she hadn't allowed herself to break down. Now, overwhelmed by exhaustion and grief, she just wanted to cry. She was a young girl, yet she had become the pillar of her family in this nightmare, holding back her tears to keep her siblings hopeful. But deep inside, she was exhausted, emotionally, physically, and psychologically. All she wanted was to let out her pain, to cry and release the heavy burden she had been carrying all this time. After about 20 minutes of continuous crying, Leslie managed to calm herself. She realized she had to restore her composure because she was their only hope, apart from God. She returned to her brother and sisters, holding them close, embracing them tightly, and promising them that she would stay with them and care for them until the very end. Today marked day 27 of the search operation, and the weather was very rainy, making the conditions even more difficult. The heavy rain prevented the search teams and soldiers, equipped with their gear, from lighting fires all night. The cold was intense, and the wind was raging fiercely. Even Wilson, the loyal search dog, was frightened by the storm. He went into a panic and ran away. Losing Wilson was a huge blow to the team because he was one of their best detection dogs. The severe storm also complicated the search because the rain and wind erased all footprints and clues that could lead them to the children. Moreover, they couldn't know how the storm had affected the children, if the intense rain and cold had overwhelmed them or caused harm, especially the baby Christine, who was vulnerable to hypothermia. Leslie and her siblings immediately felt the biting cold, even in the relatively warm Amazon rainforest, where temperatures could drop sharply during storms, particularly at night. If the children got wet from the rain, they would be at grave risk of hypothermia, especially Christine. Leslie had to rely on the survival skills she learned from her village, building a shelter from large banana leaves, which are thick and sturdy enough to serve as a makeshift tent. She and her siblings used these large leaves to create a small shelter that would provide some protection from the rain and wind. Their makeshift tent was far from perfect, but it was their only option, better than nothing. Once the storm subsided, the search teams resumed their efforts. They were somewhat discouraged because the storm likely erased the footprints and evidence that could have led them to the children. Over the next 2 days, however, a surprising discovery renewed their hope. They found the makeshift shelter the children had taken refuge in during the storm. The evidence was clear. Bite marks on the edges of the paper materials used for the shelter indicated the children had chewed the leaves to make it more secure since they had no tools. Most importantly, they found fresh footprints near the shelter, signs that the children had left the area after the storm. If these footprints had been there before the rain, they would have been washed away. This confirmed 2 vital points. First, that the children were still alive. Second, that they were nearby, probably not far from the shelter. This discovery reignited hope among the search teams, both soldiers and indigenous people. Motivated by this, they intensified their efforts, spreading out across the area, calling out for the children and searching every inch while the command center sent additional support and troops. Despite all these efforts, by day 30, the situation became puzzling and somewhat frustrating. Hundreds of searchers, including soldiers, volunteers, and indigenous people, had scoured the entire region. Yet, they still couldn't find the children. The case was becoming increasingly mysterious, especially for the leadership. Even General Sanchez, who was leading the operation, began to feel a sense of despair. The evidence of the children's presence was clear: footprints, torn clothing, and shelters, but somehow they remained elusive. This baffling situation led to various theories. The indigenous people strongly believed that the spirits of the forest were hiding the children deliberately, protecting them, or perhaps preventing their rescue. Their long-standing superstitions suggested that the spirits or gods of the forest wanted the children to stay within the woods. The leadership, however, had a more pragmatic theory. Perhaps the children were hiding out of fear of the soldiers. One of the indigenous teachers in the village used to tell stories about spirits that could transform into animals or humans, capable of abducting children and taking them deep into the forest. These tales were meant to scare children from wandering alone, but in this case, they might have had a different effect, making the children afraid of the soldiers, believing they were malevolent spirits in disguise. Grandmother Fatima, the children's grandmother, had her own theory. She believed that Leslie was hiding because she didn't want to see Manuel, their mother's abusive husband, who had been involved with the search teams. She saw him as a threat, and her fear pushed her to hide with her siblings. Fatima's view was that Leslie and the others were trying to escape from Manuel's influence and protect themselves from his harm. Each person had their own explanation for why the children remained hidden. There was no concrete proof, but the leadership knew they had to consider all possibilities. If the children were hiding out of fear, the best approach was to reassure them, showing them they were safe. The only way to do this was through recorded messages from their grandmother Fatima, speaking in their native language, urging them to cooperate with the soldiers and reassuring them that everyone was searching and trying to rescue them. The search teams and soldiers continued broadcasting these messages from helicopters and loudspeakers on the ground. Leslie heard her grandmother's voice clearly, but it would come from above, then fade away, an echo that left her longing for her grandmother's comforting words. Meanwhile, Fatima had a disturbing dream. In her dream, her daughter McDonough, the children's mother, appeared, warning her, "Why are you trying to take my children? I will keep them with me." The grandmother woke up terrified, feeling that the dream was a warning, a sign that something was preventing their rescue. As the days went on, the indigenous team's faith in the spirits of the forest grew stronger. Many of them fell ill with coughs, fevers, and fatigue. They believed that evil forces or vengeful spirits were cursing them, trying to stop them from finding the children. Some of the volunteers and indigenous people began to withdraw from the search, fearing the curses or the wrath of the spirits. Helicopters evacuated many of them from the region. As their faith wavered, this mass withdrawal was like a final blow. Many believed that if the spirits wanted the children to stay lost, then nothing could be done. The remaining indigenous people and soldiers, despite their doubts, continued helping. The soldiers provided medicines and basic medical care, treating the sick among the volunteers and indigenous tribes. As a gesture of goodwill and to foster trust, the soldiers left their weapons behind when they camped with the indigenous groups, showing respect and a desire for peaceful cooperation. Despite the fears and superstitions, everyone agreed that they had to keep trying, believing that somewhere in this vast, mysterious forest, the children were waiting to be found, and that hope was their strongest weapon against the darkness that enveloped them. This event greatly improved the relationship between the soldiers and the indigenous people. They began to sit together, share food and drinks, and lend each other tools. A truly unprecedented experience that strengthened their bonds and created a warm, friendly atmosphere between them. But a question remained on everyone's minds despite all their equipment, tents, food, and medicine. If they still suffered from illness and fatigue, what about the children? Could they be sick? Are all four of them together? Could one have fallen ill or, God forbid, passed away? These frightening questions haunted their thoughts, knowing that each passing day decreased the chances of their survival. Now, we've reached day 35, and there's been no progress in the search. The teams had found no new clues about the children. A deep sense of despair was spreading among both the soldiers and the indigenous people. More and more of them began to withdraw from the operation. Military helicopters came to evacuate groups of volunteers and indigenous tribes, as their patience and hope were running out after more than a month of searching in the dense forest. Many had to return to their families, children and loved ones waiting anxiously at home. Honestly, you can't blame them. They had done everything they could, more than they thought possible. Even the military received orders from the higher command to pull back some units, as their resources and manpower were needed elsewhere. The number of search teams, both soldiers and indigenous groups, had decreased significantly. In spite of this, General Sanchez, the commander of the operation, refused to give up. His heart was filled with a stubborn determination to find the children, no matter what. Even if they were dead, he wanted to see them alive. To boost the morale of his troops, he personally boarded a helicopter and flew into the forest. Joining the search on the ground, it's rare to see a general step down into the front line like this, especially in a non-war zone. His presence lifted the spirits of the soldiers and the remaining indigenous search teams. They resumed their efforts, tracking the trails left by the children. Trying to determine their possible route, the search area shrank considerably, making it easier to cover with fewer people. Yet, despite all their efforts, there was still no sign of the children, only silence and empty footprints, until, finally, one member of the team, surprisingly, found them. But it wasn't an ordinary discovery. This member was not human. Remember Wilson, the loyal dog who had run away during the storm? Somehow, Wilson had managed to survive and find the children. When the children saw him, they immediately felt joy and comfort. They loved Wilson and trusted him. He became their protector and companion during these difficult days. For a few days, Wilson stayed close to them, guiding their movements and providing a sense of safety. But suddenly, after some time, Wilson left them again, disappearing among the trees. The children felt a wave of sadness. They couldn't chase after him. They were too exhausted, their bodies weak and trembling from hunger and fatigue. Their little bodies had no strength left. They made a small makeshift camp, collapsing onto the ground, waiting in silence and despair. This was day 40 of the search. The indigenous volunteers were gradually leaving the forest each day. The last group was scheduled to depart that very day. The remaining soldiers and a few indigenous tribes prepared for their final attempt. Small teams scattered across the area, performing their last searches before leaving. Sadly, After a short while, everyone returned empty-handed, no signs of the children, just silence and disappointment. Some began packing their belongings, ready to leave the forest behind. But among them, 4 people, an unlikely group, had not given up yet. These 4 were still searching, pushing through the dense trees, determined to find the children until the very last moment. Suddenly, they saw a familiar figure among the trees, Wilson. He was watching them from a distance, barking loudly, then retreating again into the woods. The 4 men decided to follow him, but Wilson was faster. He vanished deep into the forest, and they lost his trail. Just as they were searching for him, they suddenly heard a sound, a baby crying. The children's cries echoed faintly but clearly, making the men freeze in place. They focused, trying to locate the source of the sound. To their surprise, the crying grew louder. They ran toward the direction of the noise, their hearts pounding with hope. And what they saw filled them with joy beyond words. The children, hiding inside a small shelter they had built from leaves and branches. They looked terrified at first, but one of the men gently stretched out his hand and said, "Familia," meaning, "We are your family. Don't be afraid." In that moment, they saw the children, disheveled, exhausted, and weak. Their condition was heartbreaking, thin, covered in dirt, and showing signs of malnutrition. The 2 little girls, only 4 years old, were in the worst shape. They could barely stand, and it looked like they might not survive the next few days if they weren't rescued immediately. The men's faces lit up with pure joy. They carefully carried the children on their backs, overwhelmed with relief. They took them back to the camp where soldiers and medical staff awaited. The children were immediately given medicine, IV drips, and warm blankets. Their bodies were in shock, and they needed immediate care to recover. Slowly, they began to regain strength, eating small amounts of food and drinking water carefully. Their mental state also started to improve as they felt the safety of being rescued. News of this incredible discovery spread rapidly. The authorities and families of the children received the news with overwhelming happiness. General Sanchez felt a profound sense of relief and pride. Grandma Fatima and the children's relatives were overjoyed. They couldn't stop crying tears of happiness. The entire Colombian nation celebrated this miraculous rescue, and the story of the children's survival became a global sensation. Almost every media outlet covered it, making it a legendary story of hope and perseverance. The children were immediately transported by planes from the rainforest to the hospital. Their health was fragile, and they had to receive the best possible care. If rescue had been delayed even a few days, some of them might not have survived. Over the following weeks, they gradually recovered, both physically and psychologically. Their vital signs stabilized, and they started to regain their strength. Leslie, the eldest, gradually regained her ability to speak normally. She recounted to the doctors everything that had happened: the crash, how she cared for her siblings, and the months lost in the forest. She said that when she saw the rescuers coming, she felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe freely, to relax, and finally, to feel safe. Their rescue was nothing short of a miracle, something you'd expect only in fairy tales. Despite the focus on the children, one of the most positive outcomes of this story was the unprecedented cooperation between the army and the indigenous tribes. This collaboration marked a turning point in Colombian history, showcasing the power of unity and trust. The Colombian president personally honored the indigenous leaders and tribes who participated in the rescue. The 4 men who found the children were celebrated and publicly praised, receiving medals and recognition from the nation. Their heroic effort united everyone. No one remained unaffected by the story of hope, faith, and resilience. However, a heartbreaking detail persisted. Wilson, the loyal dog, had disappeared into the depths of the forest. Despite extensive searches, no one could find him. Some volunteers believed that the spirits of the forest had taken Wilson as a reward for his loyalty, trading him for the children. Others thought that perhaps he had simply wandered away, lost forever in the vast wilderness. His fate remains a mystery, symbolizing the sacrifices and mysteries of the forest itself. As for Manuel, the children's stepfather, investigations confirmed the terrible stories about his abuse and violence. Authorities arrested him, and he is now in prison, awaiting trial for his crimes. The children are now under the care of the Family Safety Institution in Colombia. Their grandmother Fatima and other family members see them regularly, and after full recovery, they return to their normal lives, going back to school, dreaming of a future, and slowly healing from the trauma. Though the scars of that ordeal will remain with them forever, these children have proven that hope and perseverance can conquer even the darkest of forests. Their story remains a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unbreakable bond of family. And that, my friends, is the end of our story. I hope you enjoyed this tale of hope, courage, and unity. If you liked it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next adventure. Goodbye!